Okay, welcome back everyone. We hope yesterday was really enjoyable for you and today's also very informative. So today we will be examining how menstruation differs and compares across different cultures. So the link to yesterday's recording is available in YouTube under the Dharma Snippets channel. Definitely subscribe to that channel for more Indic types of talks and stuff. So without further ado, we can go into the presentation for today. So we'll start by recapping the Hindu view of menstruation, and then we'll look at some of other Indic faiths that stemmed from Hinduism, and then we'll explore the early civilizations, the Abrahamic faiths, and that will set us up nicely to the contemporary culture and how that narrative of menstruation has changed over time and what we can do to fix it.
Great. So let's start with a recap of yesterday's session. I'm happy to see most of you here already, but for those who missed yesterday's session and just for everyone else to get a bit of a recap, we saw that there is a lot of inherent divinity in feminine worship and the feminine form in itself in the Hindu shastras and Hindu culture. We looked at Kamakhya Devi in Assam, who is a menstruating goddess and whose menstrual cloth at the end of a menstrual cycle is actually the Mahaprasad. So clearly, there is a lot of celebration of menstruation. Even culturally in Orissa, we have Raja Parba where Bhumi Devi menstruates, and that's a huge festival across the state. Down south, we saw Kedasa, which is a similar festival to Raja Parba. We also saw a Ritukala Samskara, which Gayatri here has actually undergone, and it is an initiation of a girl into womanhood because she's gotten her first menstrual cycle, and it is a time to celebrate femininity, divinity, and menstruation in general. So clearly there is no concept of menstruation as a principle being impure or somehow base or somehow denigrating all of womankind. In fact, the menstruation is seen in the shastras through three different lenses. The first one being as a period of rest. We talked about this extensively, specifically in the context of some of the cultural practices that have come out of this, including Chaupadi, which was meant to be a really nice, palatial, comfortable place for menstruating women to relax in for 3 days, where she would have access to food, water, sanitary products, bathrooms, toilets, comfortable beds, and all of those things. Unfortunately, in some parts of the subcontinent, that has been corrupted over time, and the chaupadis that we see now are not nearly up to the standards that the shastras prescribe. But we also saw that in general the shastras advise women to take rest, not from a viewpoint of they are impure and therefore they need to be separate, but from a viewpoint of they need rest and it's a time for self growth, self purification. And this not following these rest guidelines is not papa, and it's not something to be feared, or it's not something to get angry about. It is just for the only consequences of non adherence are that you won't be rested enough. That is the only thing that the shastra is concerned about. The next, we saw menstruation as a period of austerity. Menstruation itself is considered its own tapasya, which for women helps get rid of several vikarmas or helps us neutralize several bad actions that we would have committed in the past. And third, it is a time for self purification. We saw that we had three vyavaharik koshas that menstruation affected: the annamaya or the physical body, the pranamaya kosh or the vital or the energy body, and the manomaya kosh, which is the mental body. And on all three levels there were different kinds of purification that were happening. On the physical body, we got rid of the menstrual blood. At the pranamaya level, we got rid of excess apanavayu, and at the manomaya kosh level, we got rid of negative emotions like anger, fear, greed. A lot of the controversy or the misconception about menstruation in Hinduism arises from the misuse of the word ashaucha. We saw that ashaucha means unclean, not impure per se, and unclean, that word ashaucha has only and only been used for menstrual blood that has been discarded. It is not used for the process of menstruation itself, which, as you have seen, is holy and revered. And it is not used for a woman who is menstruating. And it is most definitely not used for all of womankind. In fact, a shaucha is used for almost all bodily excreta, urine, feces, and even sweat. So this was a small recap of yesterday, but several of the questions that we got yesterday, we didn't have enough time, so we hope to address them now. A lot of the questions we had revolved around the specificities of deity worship, of Tulsi Puja, and even cooking for special occasions like religious festivals or even cooking prasadam. And our answer to that is similar to what we said yesterday as well, is that the shastras give us the principles, which is what we have presented to you. We have given you viewpoints straight from the shastras, and we've even quoted exactly where we got the viewpoints from. Now, these shastric principles have been implemented and applied into daily life differently by different sampradayas, based on their different contexts, based on different traditions. And over time, these traditions have changed and evolved or solidified. So, and that is the beauty of Sanatan Dharma. Sanatan Dharma actually allows that and encourages it, which is why our Guru Shishya Parampara even exists, to apply and implement shastric principles according to today's values and according to today's context. So, in terms of the specificities of deity worship, some people asked us about standards of deity worship and how to maintain those, and those specific questions. So our answer to that is that for those specificities, it is much better to reach out to the leaders of your own sampradaya or your own tradition that you are following, because they will have better answers. We are only giving you viewpoints directly from the shastras. And it's the same for Tulsi Puja and cooking. And we also had questions about worshipping Hanumanji because he's a brahmachari. And I'd also like to say, sometimes we really, as human beings, we really overestimate our own value. I have to say, like, we as people can't really have a major effect on Hanumanji in any aspect of his being or existence. So it's entirely, the shastras leave that to our discretion. The shastras don't have any specific bans, and they don't have any specific compulsions for what we have to do. So either way, it's not a thing to be worried about or scared about for us.
Exactly. So the understanding that we want to give you is that we can't really tell you what to do or what to not do, because doing that would directly contradict what Sanatan Dharma stands for and represents. We can, however, give you some modern and contextual understanding to help you integrate these Shastric principles into your life. So here we can see the general trend of how people tend to align. On the far left, we have extreme liberalism, and on the far right, we have extreme traditionalism. I want to make it extremely clear that, in my humble opinion, both sides are wrong. Being extremely traditional, such as thinking that women are impure for menstruating or women will defile things during menstruation, is grossly incorrect, as we debunked yesterday. But at the same time, discarding all notions of purification, austerity, and rest in the name of equality is equally incorrect. Because the farther you move away from these core values, that women were treated special in the Shastras and they were given special care and attention during menstruation. So when you move as far away from that as possible, you actually hurt the majority of women that these rules and guidelines were made for. So we can see that being both sides of these extremism is wrong. So what's the solution, right? So we need to come to an even middle ground. And the best way to modernize without westernizing is to incorporate some divisions of labor.
And
So
the important thing to remember is that the point of the Shastras is to help Samaj and to help women. That's the goal of the Shastras. The larger purpose to all of these guidelines that are given is the protection of women or the progress of women and the betterment of Samaj. So, as long as those purposes are being fulfilled, then the rules or the dictates that you follow to achieve that purpose matter less. The focus should be on the purpose and not the details of the rules.
Exactly. She's completely correct. If those rules aren't serving their purpose for you, you need to reevaluate that for yourself. So, living in the West is very different than living in India. So, I'll repeat that again. Families living in the West face very different issues and norms and cultures, and that's where a lot of your questions arose from to begin with. Because of the difference between the nuclear and joint family, there's not a lot of help that people in the West can get. Just looking at the numbers, the US Census released that the average household size in the United States is 2.6 people. Juxtapose that with the average household size in India, 4.9 people. So right off the bat, we can see that so much help available in the East that's not in the West. And that's exactly why working women in the West report to be burnt out a lot more often than people working women in the East. So, what can we do to fix this, right? It's very simple. Incorporate the values, the liberal values that are preached in the West of equality, cooperation, and respect into your household chores that necessarily don't fill out gender roles. For example, I know so many boys who cook and clean in the West because those are life skills that you need to, be able to live in here. And girls mow the lawns and like so forth. So incorporating these divisions of labor and fraternity that is available in the West into your life, into your lifestyle here is truly being a true advocate for equality. A true advocate for equality will educate men and change the narrative to support fraternity and liberal values such as the division of labor. So that is our answer to the type of questions that were asked yesterday.
And I hope that answers a lot of the questions that we got but could not really get to yesterday. And if there are, of course, if there are more questions, feel free to add them in the chat box. So now let's come to other Indic faiths. So now we saw that Hinduism, how Hinduism was predominantly, functioning in India. But of course, it's not the only faith that has been propagated in the subcontinent. So let's look at some of the other faiths and how they have come about. So, this is a brief timeline of major events that have happened in the Indian subcontinent. So, we can very comfortably date the existence of Hinduism to at least 5000 BC, although it is a well accepted paradigm that Hinduism has been existed, for a few 100,000 years even before this. However, this is just for our context. Then around 500 BC is the foundation of Buddhism, with the birth of Gautam Buddha and his enlightenment, and then his foundation of the Bauddhic principles. Around 400 BC is Jainism, and 1500 AD is the foundation of Sikhism in response to several of the Islamic invasions that happened from the northwest of India. Sikhism as an offshoot of Hinduism to fight the Islamic invasions. But there's another date here, which is 200 BC, which is the propagation of Chinese Buddhism. Now, this I have kept here specifically because this is an important point in history that we decided needs to be talked about, because we want to show that there is a huge gap between how Buddhism was founded and when it was founded, and when it was propagated and when it spread. So there is a stark difference oftentimes between the actual foundational principles that Gautam Buddha gave and the way that Buddhist principles are practiced in other parts of the world, because they have been propagated much later and propagated in their own different way. And we'll study them in more detail as we go along. So now, but let's just see how these have come about philosophically. And philosophically, you can see that all Indic faiths basically originate from different aspects of Hinduism, and Jainism and Buddhism both come out of the Nastika aspects of Hinduism. Nastika, as you know, most Hindi speaking people would know, is basically the idea that these faiths don't believe in a form god, or a god who has a specific form, or even a supreme being altogether. Um, they they can believe in shastric principles like karma, reincarnation, but not god as a form per se. And so today we'll study these three faiths in particular: Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism, simply because of numbers. simply because these are the most relevant faiths in today's time, and also the ones that have more literature associated with them. So let's get into Jainism. Now, the foundational principle of Jainism is ahimsa, or non-violence. And the idea is that anything that propagates ahimsa is good, and anything that propagates ahimsa, that propagates himsa or violence, is bad. So any, you basically want to be on the ahimsa side of things versus the himsa side of things. And because this is a nastika faith, there is no god, and they believe in the betterment and the purification of a person himself or herself. So menstruation also has to be seen in the context of ahimsa versus himsa for Jainism. Now, in the Jain society and culture, women are very important. They make up two out of the four pillars of the Jain Sangha, or pious community. Um, so in that sense, in a cultural sense and in a belonging sense, women are very, very important and very vital. Um, however, through time, as is the case with Buddhism, Jainism has separated into sects. The most common, the most prominent of ones are Shwetambar and Digambar philosophies, and there are slightly differing viewpoints on menstruation. But basically, the understanding for both of these sects is that because menstruation causes himsa, it is therefore a negative process. Now, this is not misogynistic in a sense, because every bodily process almost causes some kind of himsa according to Jainism, either to microorganisms or to other small jivas or living beings. So any bodily process causes himsa. Menstruation is a bodily process that also causes himsa, and therefore from that perspective is seen in a negative light, but is not necessarily misogynistic in that sense. Now, coming to Buddhism. Now, the propagation of Buddhism, like I mentioned, has happened over multiple centuries. So the way Buddhism is practiced in one area might be completely different from the way Buddhism is practiced in another area. And although they are all based foundationally on Gautam Buddha's principles, it is quite common to see that there's almost a 180-degree difference in the interpretation of some of these principles. So for our purposes, and for our purposes, we'll just take a look at two specific ones. But before that, what does Gautam Buddha himself say about menstruation? And the truth is nothing much, because Buddhist doctrine by and large doesn't talk much about gender roles, gender differences. It talks more about dhamma and atma, and the giving up of desires, and the eightfold path to renunciation. So there is very little mentioned about gender roles or menstruation in particular by Gautam Buddha himself. But later on, many opinions and many principles around menstruation get incorporated into Buddhism. So let's take a look. And today we'll be focusing on two specific types of Buddhism: Taiwanese Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism. Now, as you can see, these are both propagated slightly differently, and but all both of them have very negative connotations that they have attached to menstruation because of local practices. Now, for instance, the negative attributions to menstruation in Chinese Buddhism come a lot from the Taoism philosophy, and which by definition considers women to be lower, baser, and more impure than men. And it's a similar thing with Taiwanese Buddhism as well. That if you can see, it says the female defects of greed, hate, and delusion and other defilements are greater than a man's. And the implication here in the later half of the sentence is that this is attributed to menstruation. But again, this is nowhere to be found in Gautam Buddha's original teachings. So this is more a product of cultural Buddhism rather than actual scriptural Buddhism. And cultural Buddhism, as we saw, was propagated in different centuries, so they would have a lot more differences in how it's been practiced. All right, now let's go to Sikhism. So as we know, the main literature in Sikhism is the Guru Granth Sahib, and we've quoted the Guru Granth Sahib directly here, where Guru Nanak talks about women, and he's basically saying that the woman is our friend, and from woman is family, and from women are the bonds of the world. So there is no perspective that looks at women as lower or evil or impure in a certain way. It is clearly acknowledged that women are the pillars of family, of pillars of love, and also pillars of society. So that's the scriptural aspect of Sikhism. Coming to the cultural aspect of Sikhism, by and large, there aren't any restrictions placed on menstruating women when it comes to, say, entering the Gurudwara or maybe cooking for langar or things like that. So that's the general, that's the general principle around Sikhism. So now this gives you an idea about these three more prominent Indic faiths. Of course, there are a lot of other Indic faiths that we can't get to, but these are the three important ones. And now that we've covered India in general, like we've seen the history of India over time a little bit, and we've seen Hinduism through the scripture, also through culture, and we have hopefully taken a good view at these three and other Indic faiths from their own scriptures and today's culture also. Now let's expand our view a little bit and go completely global. And we are talking about really global, as in we're going to discuss all of these ancient civilizations. So let's take a look into these global civilizations. Okay, so this is again, this is a brief timeline that is showing us the propagation of these different ancient civilizations and when they existed. And for today's purpose, we'll be taking the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman civilizations. Now, the dates are not so important here, but I want to bring your attention to one particular date on this timeline, and that is 475 AD, which we've marked as the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, this is extremely important because 475 AD is the year that the entire culture of the world changes. And I'm not exaggerating. 475 AD marks the fall of the Roman Empire, and it marks the advent of Abrahamic faiths. Not the advent per se, but the dominance of Abrahamic faiths. Abrahamic faiths are basically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Those are the main Abrahamic faiths. And Abrahamic faiths, by and large, are completely opposite to all of these old ancient cultures in terms of their philosophy, their worldview, and everything else. So keep that 475 AD year in mind. And now let's look at each of these ancient pagan civilizations.
Exactly. So Brinda mentioned that the start of the Abrahamic faiths was completely opposite to whatever was there before, the pagan side. So let's take a look at the dichotomy in the pagan faith. So ancient pagan faiths existed in a dichotomy, you could say, regarding menstruation. Paganism is basically the belief in multiple gods, like Hinduism. So on one hand, they knew that female goddesses watched over fertility and menstruation, which means they revered and worshipped female goddesses, and its functions were considered divine and worshipped. Fertility and childbirth under the purview of female menstruation and female goddesses was extremely important and pivotal to pagan culture and belief. However, there was the idea that menstruating women were considered to have the ability to make things impure and kill the spirit of everything. So we can see how this dichotomy existed of revering and praying to female goddesses, but at the same time, a female biological process such as menstruation was considered to have innate abilities of danger. So let's start with the Greek civilization and see what they have to say. So in Grecian times, menstruation was considered sacred and life-giving, associated with fertility and motherhood, and it was deeply connected to the worship of the goddess Artemis. So Artemis was the goddess of hunt. She was the twin sister of Apollo, the sun god. And she was also considered to be the patron or the protector of young girls. In fact, menstruation was a fundamental factor that defined young girls' transitions into womanhood. So what were some of the rituals associated with this? So similar to the Hritikala Samskara we saw in Hinduism, Athenian girls participated in a similar ritual known as the bear dance. So this was a ceremony dedicated to the goddess Artemis. It was to signify the fact that Artemis would now watch over these girls, and these girls were now in her care. So in the bear dance, they were considered to be tamed after this dance. The taming signified the transition from a wild and free-spirited childhood to the gradual acceptance of responsibilities as an adult. So in Grecian times, a lot of female divinity was associated with menstruation, and it was an event that was celebrated as auspicious since it marked the moment you were now in Artemis's care. However, the dichotomy is present again with this concept of miasma. So the onset of menstruation, a largely positive and natural process, came with a factor of miasma, which is roughly translated to not suitable. Miasma was not particular to menstruation. I want to make that clear. It was just the idea that there's a contagious power that has an independent life of its own that could harm those who came into contact with it. So there was this idea that menstruating women in particular had lots of miasma, and they were not suitable for certain things, and coming in contact with the menstruating woman would cause like illness or misfortune or miscarriage of a pregnant woman, and even death. So therefore, there was significant restriction on movement of Grecian women during menstruation. So there we can see that there's this dichotomy, that there was a celebration of the first period through the bear dance and all those taming rituals and the worship of the goddess Artemis. But again, the concept of miasma was so present, and it caused lots of restriction on movement for women. So now let's go to the Roman civilizations. In Roman civilizations, like Greeks, on one hand, associated menstruation with impurity, and on the other hand, perceived its sacred aspects and worshipped the Roman counterpart of the goddess Artemis, Diana. So, like Artemis, she was the goddess of the hunt, the moon, menstruation, and childbirth. So Romans also associated impurity with menstruation, and they believed that there were subtle energies associated with this impurity that could have effects on human activities, plants, insects, etc. So in a sense, they followed a stricter version of miasma with regards to menstruation, and they would often describe women to be in like a heightened state of energy during menstruation, and therefore that could cause people great harm. So menstruation was perceived as a constant source of danger to everyone, despite its divine abilities. So I want to make that very clear. They did perceive this as a divine, and they worshipped menstruation processes and female goddesses, but they did understand that there was some sort of danger. So now let's take a look as to how this cultural perception changed over time. So how did something that have such intrinsic female divinity in and of itself become something of a bad connotation over time? Like, how did that happen? So basically, historians give us the reasoning that the Greek and Roman civilizations transitioned from a very matriarchal society to patriarchal societies because of increased wartime. So let me make that like a little bit more clear. There's no other situation in the world that exemplifies stronger gender roles than wartime, because the Greeks and Romans were always fighting with each other, trying to conquer one another. And the increase in men going to fight and women staying back at home causes gender roles in society to become really prominent. And over time, there was a gradual shift from a very egalitarian or even matriarchal society that embodied feminine worship and divinity to a more transactional black and white patriarchal society. So that shift marked a time which also caused misunderstanding of menstruation. So it didn't have its divine and worshipable aspects anymore. It was just reduced to the miasma concepts. So now let's take a look at Mesopotamian civilizations. Mesopotamians, also like the Greeks and Romans, had a goddess that watched over menstruation known as Ishtar or Inanna, and she was central in Babylonian theology. However, the role of women in Mesopotamian society was primarily childbearing, and therefore menstruation was often seen as a sign that you were not pregnant. And thus, it was perceived to be like a physical wound or an injury that required some care. And that's why historians have found that women from the Mesopotamian civilizations menstruated very rarely. Their primary duty was to bear children, and the most healthy and fertile women would have consecutive pregnancies up until menopause or death. So now let's take a look at the Egyptian civilizations. So there were three main goddesses that watched over female health. The first of which is Isis, the goddess of menstruation, childbirth, and other biological processes. The second was Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, sensuality. And the third, Sekhmet, was the goddess of blood, and more particularly the natal blood, the blood on the battlefield, or menstrual blood. So we can see right off the bat that there was so much feminine divinity associated with female biological processes involving menstruation. So these goddesses represented and governed different aspects of a woman's life, from childhood to gaining adulthood, marked by the onset of menstruation, to motherhood. In fact, menstruation was also, put in the same metaphor as the floods of the river Nile. So Egyptians would often compare the cyclical floods of the river Nile that would rejuvenate the crops around the banks to the cyclical process of menstruation that cleanses and prepares the way for renewal and regenesis. So we can see that the Egyptians compared something as critical as the river Nile to menstruation, which gives it so much, it shows how much importance and value they gave to this process. So there were many other ideas associated with menstruation, the first of which is Hisman. So Hisman can be roughly translated to the process of purification. So we saw in the River Nile analogy that the cyclical floods of the River Nile would rejuvenate crops, and therefore the cyclical process of menstruation rejuvenated a woman's body and renewed it for fertility. So upon Hisman, women were divine again. So this also shows how this is no way in a negative context. It's simply a time of rejuvenation. The next concept, Bwit, explained how women during menstruation were just not in a state to continue their normal activities. So they had to be like maybe isolated or separated from society, and they couldn't do some things like entering temples, eating certain foods, and they even had separate quarters to live during this time. It's also really important to note that out of these civilizations, Egyptian women had the most rights, and you can see in their understanding of menstruation how it's equated to the river Nile, honestly, how progressive they were at that time.
Now, let's come to the Abrahamic faiths. Now, I mentioned that all these ancient pagan faiths, all of these Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, they all fall under the larger umbrella of ancient pagan faiths, although they seem really different from each other and they had different names and different gods associated with each ideology. They by and large believed in the same set of principles in terms of theology. Now, let me explain what that means. It means all of them were polytheistic faiths, they were pluralistic faiths, and they had multiple gods who were rooted in nature. So polytheism basically means you have multiple gods, and in often all of these gods interacted with women, with men and women on earth as well. And there were several other ways that you could access these gods apart from simply prayer. uh, Pluralistic means there could be different tribes with different cultures which had different presiding deities for each of them, and that was also accepted. So by and large, all of these ancient faiths followed the same theological paradigms, and all these paradigms then are about to change drastically when the Abrahamic faiths come about. So at 475 AD, which is the fall of the Roman Empire, somebody in the comments mentioned that the Eastern Roman Empire existed even after that. It did, but in a state of disarray, and we'll talk about why, in just a couple of slides. But now let's look at Abrahamic faiths and what they represent. So we talked about what ancient pagan faiths represent, like multiple deities, multiple gods, and predominance of nature deities and nature worship. So now let's look at what Abrahamic faiths stand for. Abrahamic faiths basically stand for almost opposite principles compared to the ancient pagan faiths. And there are, in the context of our talk with regards to menstruation, there are three specific things that ties all of these Abrahamic faiths together. Number one is that all of them start from the original sin, as in they all believe in the Adam and Eve story, or the Adam and Eve scripture, which Gayatri will talk about in some time. Number two, they are all monotheistic, which means there is only one God, and that one God for all Abrahamic faiths is a male God. Therefore, there is no worship of femininity, or there is no feminine deity that they can worship. And number three, it's exclusionary cultural norms, which basically means that it's not pluralistic. There are specific sets of norms that are given to you, and those have to be followed. And the non following of these norms can lead to your excommunication or exclusion from the faith. Now, let's
Exactly.
get into these a little more in detail, starting with the original sin.
Right, so let's pick apart the first idea, the fall of Eve, which all the Abrahamic faiths conclude as was the original sin, and a lot of their narrative stems from that. So basically, the story of the Abrahamic faiths is that the fall of Eve, and is that God put Adam and Eve, the first humans he made, into a very beautiful garden and told them to eat anything but from the tree of knowledge. And Lucifer, the devil, went to Eve and persuaded her to eat from the tree of knowledge. So Eve initially refuses, but then she's curious and eats the apple, shares it with Adam, and as a result, God condemns the both of them, but womankind, as a result, bears the brunt of this. So women have already been considered disadvantaged in the Abrahamic faiths because of their origin, Eve, and menstruation has just been co-opted into this narrative as a justification for the denigration of women. So obviously, the extent to how much you apply this to your culture based on if you're a Jew, a Christian, or Muslim will differ. But we can see that pretty much this is accepted in all the three faiths. So there's a hadith which is used in the book for Islamic faith followers that describes that if it were not for the misfortune that befell Eve, women on earth would not menstruate, they would be good natured, and they would have easy pregnancies. So this associates the fact that women menstruate, have difficult pregnancies, or may have negative personality traits to the original sin of Eve. The story goes to show how, although Eve ate the apple, she also coerced Adam eating the apple as well. So, by that same vein, there's this idea that women are not good natured and are corrupters of men. So, are women really corrupters of men? Here we can see that the Abrahamic scriptural precedents use menstruation as a tool to propagate the idea that women are the corruptors of men. From the Zohar, which is part of the Old Testament, it is said that women who don't follow nidda, and nidda is a Jewish practice, a Jewish segregational practice during menstruation, can pollute their husbands, implying that she's corrupting him, right? So another example from Ezekiel is really important here too. The verse basically compares the land of Israel and the civilization at that time, which was really primitive, to menstruation. So we can see that whenever they wanted to compare something that was unrefined, barbaric, unclean, they compared it to menstruation, giving it a really bad context, something that Hinduism didn't do. And the words here are very clear as to how they compare the uncleanliness of a primitive society to the uncleanliness of menstruation.
And compare this to a Vashishta Dharma Sutra, that we discussed yesterday, that compared the limbs of a woman to the feet of a brahmana or the hump of a cow, and said categorically that these could never be impure. So there's a huge dichotomy here. And even there, we can clearly see the dichotomy between ancient pagan faiths and Abrahamic faiths already. Because At the time of menstruation, women, for example, in the Greek philosophy, came under the care of goddess Artemis in a very positive way. But here, the onset of menstruation is almost equivalent to the onset of an impurity. And in that same vein, let's go to the second principle that binds all of these Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together, which is monotheistic worship. I touched on it a bit earlier. Monotheism basically means there is only one true God. Now, let's get this. There might be some confusion here because there are some Indic, there's some Indic literature and some Indic leaders, including Hindus, that have a confusion about this. Indic faiths might say that God is one. That is different from saying there is one God. God is one means that the tattva of God, or the satya, or the truth of God, the principle of God is universal and therefore is one. But it can be worshipped, it can be approached, and it can be dealt with in hundreds and thousands of different ways. So Hinduism and all Indic faiths by and large are pluralistic, which means they allow for multiple types of and multiple cultures of worship. And they are also they also polytheistic in the sense that there can be multiple gods that you worship, although the principle behind those gods is one. But that does not mean that there is only one true God. That is the complete opposite philosophy. And this one true God philosophy is the one that all Abrahamic faiths follow. These gods are all male, and they are the only one true God. So you cannot worship anyone else except that one true God. And since all these gods are male, like we mentioned, any concept of feminine worship is now removed. So clearly, while the ancient pagan faiths also all had some concepts of, menstrual blood being impure or menstruating women being restricted in certain sections, they all had an underlying philosophy of feminine divinity because they were worshippers of so many pagan goddesses. But that all goes away with the advent of Abrahamic faiths. And with this monotheistic worship principle is implicit that to go closer to that one true God, you have to go farther away from every other God. In fact, it's not implicit, it's practiced on a day to day basis. Now, even historically, back to the question of what happened to the Roman Empire and to the dwindling Eastern Roman Empire, and what happens was the purge of the pagans. Because of this principle that you cannot worship anybody else except the one true God, everyone in the Roman Empire who were following their previous pagan traditions and pagan theologies, they were brutally massacred. I'm not making this up. This is not an exaggeration. This is just historical fact. And the basis of that massacre was nothing but the principle that all Abrahamic faiths have of monotheistic worship. So we see that in the purge of the pagans, what happened was any connection to your pagan ideology is taken away, including this connection of menstruation being divine, menstruation being linked to goddesses. Because goddesses themselves are no longer present. They're not available for you to worship. And therefore the connection with the divine and the connection of femininity and divinity is broken.
Exactly. That was explained extremely well. So the idea that women are corrupters of men and moving away from paganism to monotheistic worship, literally massacring those who respected female divinity, resulted in a lot of exclusionary and oppressive practices for women of Abrahamic faiths. So let's take a look at how there was menstrual segregation. So here we can see that Christian women were fully prohibited during of taking communion during menstruation. This is something that maybe a lot of us don't know, but this was a straight up prohibition that stemmed from Genesis. As we can see, the verse talks about how people should not touch the menstrual rag, for that impurity will be transferred unto you, which describes menstruation in a very low, primitive, and infectious manner. In fact, the entire idea behind this verse stems from the story of Jesus and the woman who was menstruating for 12 years. So for those of you who don't know the story goes basically that there was a woman who was perpetually menstruating for 12 years, and Jesus was going through a crowd one day, and she touches his cloak and he falls sick. So the next day he asks his followers and everyone who was in the crowd who touched him, and the woman will meekly say, "It was me." And he says, "That's okay, I forgive you." So there are two main points we want to pull from this story. First of all, Jesus says, "I forgive you," which means that menstruating women were not supposed to touch him in the first place, and he had to forgive her for her transgressions. And secondly, if Jesus himself can fall sick from the touch of menstruating women, ordinary men just don't stand a chance. So that's why Christian women are prohibited from taking communion during menstruation. However, these exclusionary practices were not specific to Christianity. In fact, Islam has a lot of exclusionary practices, and this picture on the left is taken straight from the Hanafi school of Islamic law, which is actually currently practiced in 16 different countries, ranging from secular country Turkey all the way to parts of Russia, to Palestinian areas in Israel. And it's not explained as to why you have to follow them. These are just jurisdictions and rules that are imposed on women. And if you actually take a look at the second to last bullet point on the picture, it actually quotes some of their scriptural precedents as to missing some prayers and fasting during menstruation, which shows how deeply ingrained there is no female divinity, and women are corrupters of men, and they need to be separated from society, and so on.
Now let's look at the cultural aspects of menstruation and Abrahamic principles. What we talked to you about right now, these three principles of Abrahamic faiths, they're all straight from scriptures. But now let's look at some of the cultural influences that exist across the world. So, for example, in Abrahamic faith, specifically in the Arabic areas, there's this concept of using henna as a denoter of specific periods with regards to your menstrual cycle. So traditionally, at the end of a menstrual cycle, Islamic women take a purificatory bath and become clean or pure again. And after that bath, they apply henna on their hands. And this henna is meant to signify a few things. Number one, that they're pure again. Number two, that because there are several restrictions on them during their menstrual cycle, they are now free of those restrictions, including enjoying some sensual pleasures. And number three, while a woman is menstruating, she is extremely susceptible to the Islamic concept of jinn, or the evil eye. And now that she's no longer susceptible to that, the henna helps ward off that jinn. So this is just one small example in which Abrahamic cultures influence menstrual cycles, and they influence the culture around menstrual cycles for a lot of the people. But this is just like one small practice, right? What if I told you that the Abrahamic viewpoint on menstruation exists in every single field of the world? I'm not exaggerating. Abrahamic faiths dominate the discourse, the populations and institutions around the world, including in India. And we'll come to why a little later. But and one such field that you would not think that these religious scriptures would influence is medicine, correct? Or science. But we would be wrong.
Removing the female divinity in culture hasn't been more clear than the original use of the hysterectomy. So the hysterectomy is the full removal of a uterus. So there was a very common term used for emotional women, and it was known as female hysteria. So the notion that there's female-specific hysteria is quite ridiculous to begin with, but what's even more ridiculous is that the solution to this disease was a hysterectomy. As we know, removing a uterus has no impact on mental health whatsoever. However, You can see because the Abrahamic faiths had removed female divinity completely, the issue of the hysterectomy wasn't seen as controversial during this time. The word hysterectomy comes from the literal Greek and Latin roots hystericus or hysterikos, which means of the womb. So the very first hysterectomy performed in the 1800s in Manchester, England, was done by a Dr. Charles Clay, follower of the Catholic Church, and it was obviously a misdiagnosis and led to her death. And there were like thousands of false hysterectomies, misdiagnosed hysterectomies performed on emotional women. And sadly, this was fully believed to be the cure for female hysteria up until 1950. This practice isn't even that old. It literally goes to show you how the womb is treated as an issue and it needs to be removed because there's no female divinity in its cultural context. Okay, so if you still think that's a little, that 1950s, that's a while ago, almost a century old, that's not true. What's even more sad is the removal of femininity and the taboo around menstruation still hasn't gone away. Let's take a look at some commercials that exemplify this. Here are a couple ads taken from the last 2 months. As you can see, not a single one is showing red blood. It shows how taboo menstruation is in the 21st century. The most liberal and the most progressive of the countries, United States, and it's showing you how deeply ingrained the Abrahamic view of menstruation really is. What are these advertisements teaching us? They're basically giving us the false idea of what this really even is. They want to take us as far away from the reality as possible by using some mysterious blue and purple unicorn liquids and making scented hygiene products, which please don't use them, they're not safe. And it clearly shows how far the world is from the truth.
And this is the first myth that we debunked, if you remember. The first myth that we debunked yesterday was that menstruation is hush hush and, not talked about in Hindu scriptures. Because we saw like literally 8 different ways in which menstruation is talked about at so many different levels, right from Kama Sutra to Ayurveda to yoga to Dharma Sutras, everywhere. And it's definitely not hush hush. And now compare these visuals that you see on your screen to the visuals we saw yesterday of Kamakhya Devi's yoni and Kamakhya Devi's statue outside the temple, where she is clearly shown menstruating with bright red kumkum at her, depicting the menstrual blood. Not only that, as we mentioned, her Mahaprasad, the Devi's Mahaprasad, is her menstrual blood itself. The menstrual cloth that has soaked menstrual blood is her Mahaprasad. Now just compare and contrast those two visuals, and look at these. Like this is a product only and only of Abrahamic institutions. This othering of menstruation and this not talking about menstruation and things like that, this does not exist in Hindu culture, in Hindu shastras. It does not exist in other Hindu Indic faiths. That, like, for example, Gautam Buddha, he didn't need to talk about it because it was a non-issue per se. It became an issue only when Buddhism reached Taiwan and China. So this is not an issue for us. It is an issue that has come to us from Abrahamic philosophy. And please, the unfortunate reality of today's Indian society is that Hindu shastras and our ancestors, they were way more progressive and way more open about menstruation than we are today. That's the sad bit, and it's like it makes me feel really unfortunate about our circumstances. But we must also try and understand why that is. And that is because of the simple principle of colonization. Now we all know we've been colonized by the British. Got colonized by Islamists before the British. But the colonization was not just limited to looting land and looting money and looting gold. No. The worst form of colonization was intellectual colonization and institutional colonization. Let me tell everyone that there is not a single institution in India that is not Abrahamic. Every single institution that we operate under, except our temples and religious institutions, starting right from the top with the structure of our government. It is decidedly Abrahamic. It is not, this is not an Indian structure of government. Now, I am not talking about good and bad, right and wrong, positives, negatives, pros and cons. Okay, that is different. I am just talking about, is it based on Hindu shastras or based on Abrahamic shastras? That is all that I'm talking about. And the fact is that our institutions are not based on Hindu shastras and Hindu philosophy and Hindu culture and Hindu society. They are based on Abrahamic principles, right from a government. Definitely our educational system, anyone who has gone through it clearly knows. All our other systems, only maybe the panchayat system is left, that is Indic. But all our courts, all our judicial systems, legal systems, our constitution, all of that is decidedly based on Abrahamic principles. And we have been so intellectually colonized and so institutionally colonized that we do not even know what our own shastras say. Because if we knew how comfortable our shastras were with menstruation, the high position that shastras give women, the immense divinity that shastras see in women, in the female form, in menstruation itself, can you imagine female genitalia being worshipped anywhere else on planet Earth? In fact, I'm sure some of you also would have taken a double look at yourself, say, oh, is this actually real? Is this happening? And there were a couple of comments yesterday about it, that, oh, is Kamakhya Devi real? Yes, she is very real. She is very, very real. Because we do not know what actually Indic culture is, what our Hindu shastras are. And we are fully colonized by Abrahamic theology, right? And this is not just for us, this is all around the world. We are literally Hinduism and some parts of Southeast Asia is the only existing pagan ideology on earth today. Every other pagan ideology has been wiped out by Abrahamic faiths. Do you see Greek gods being worshipped? Do you see Egyptian gods being worshipped? No. Why? Because they don't exist anymore. Because things like purge of the pagans happened in Rome, where people at the threat of dying had to choose to convert to Abrahamic faiths. So there is only, Hinduism is the only ancient faith, and other Indic faiths and other Southeast Asian faiths, which are also rooted in Vedic Shastras, but they are the only ones that exist today that are non-Abrahamic and that have survived the onslaught of Abrahamic spread across the world. So let's please understand that our institutions are still Abrahamic. And on many occasions, because of our Abrahamic education systems, our thought process is also Abrahamic. We need to go back to this Hindu thought process. You know, if we want to be more free about talking about menstruation, if we want to get rid of these taboos that are attached to menstruation, if we want to get rid of this notion that menstruation is impure, all we have to do is look at our own heritage. It's right there for us. It's being practiced for thousands of years still today, despite so many attempts. You know, so that is, so where do we go from here? Like, you know, people talked about education. Absolutely, educate yourselves, educate everyone else. That is the most important thing. And not just our menstruation, we chose this because it's a widely misunderstood, hotly debated topic, and people have just by now taken it to mean, oh yeah, this might be like one fault of Hinduism, or, you know, like this is a controversial area. It's not, it's clearly not. And I hope over the last 2 days you've, you know, come to the same conclusion that we have come to with regards to this.
Exactly.
So, keeping in line with this, we have decided to have another seminar similar to this one on sati, which for us especially holds the same level of controversy, notoriety, misunderstanding, and misappropriation as menstruation. Um, and so, you know, we'll do it in the same way, this Zoom or an online seminar. We don't know exactly when, but it'll be relatively soon in the upcoming weeks.
It's
So
in the
so if you want to know more about sati and debunk more myths about Hinduism and more and break false narratives that have existed, then please join us.